Okay, welcome. Welcome to all of you, students, faculty, colleagues, and invited guests to this lecture or talk tonight by Professor Menas Kafatos, who is a professor at Chapman University. Some of you will be familiar with his work. Menas has had a long history of working both in the field of quantum physics as well as in applied spirituality, or perhaps spirituality. And he's an ardent practitioner of Kashmiri Shaivism, and he and I have had a chance to talk about that. And I, after that, developed an interest myself to check it out. He's a prolific writer. He's written more books than I can remember, much less read all of them. And he has kindly agreed to take some time tonight to talk to us. See, the context for this is at our center, the Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality, and Public Policy. One of the things we do in our work on applied spirituality and public policy is to ensure that as we draw from the wisdom traditions, whether these be Advaita Vedanta, Kashmiri Shaivism, Taoism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and so on, and all the other traditions, that we seek for those gems of wisdom and truth within these traditions, not the organized form of the religion. So we are a secular spirituality group, and we double check to ensure that what we are researching on and teaching is consistent with modern scientific thinking and research. Of course, there are huge contradictions between traditional science, i.e. Newtonian, reductionist, deterministic type science, and religion. We are not at all in that realm. The sciences we are talking about are the more recent modern sciences of complexity theory and quantum-like modeling, or indeed quantum physics. And so that's why we are so especially delighted that Professor Kafatos would take the time to talk to us, since he is living evidence and proof of the convergence of these two streams of human search for knowledge, truth, and better grasp on reality. So welcome again to all of you. I'm sure you will enjoy thoroughly this evening. Professor Kafatos will speak for about 45 minutes or so, Menas, and after that we'll have a Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will, at the end, curate those questions and pose them to Professor Kafatos for his responses. So without any further ado, then, it's my honor and pleasure to invite Professor Kafatos to give his talk. Over to you, Menas.
Thank you, Naresh. I guess we'll speak on a first name basis.
That's fine.
It's easier that way. It's better. It's more fitting scientists. And I mean scientists here as the seekers of knowledge, not just the natural scientists, but natural scientists sometimes believe that the only science there is physics, chemistry, biology. But of course, we know that science comes from the word scientio, which means knowledge. And I would say a little bit more about that today. I'm very happy to see you. Of course, it's also Naresh, and also to see my friend Sudeep, and with whom I'm working very closely. We're working actually, all of us, all three of us, in different ways. And thank you, Divya, for also for making this possible in many ways. And the anonymous IT person, I don't know who it is, but makes this possible. So, so let me just say a couple of things, and then I'll jump right into some of the points. It's usually considered that I think as Naresh just pointed out that perhaps science and spirituality are two different paths, but this was not always the case, and in fact. I would say for the majority of the time, it was not the case. It's a recent outcome, perhaps, of the Age of Reason that in the West started with the, and but it has now taken over quite a bit in the way that we scientists approach the nature of reality, and we tend to identify spirituality with religion, and then of course you have all kinds of issues there because unfortunately religion, rather than uniting all of us, it tends to divide us. The religious leaders, who many of them, particularly in India, were actually yogis, or they were philosophers. They certainly did not intend it that way, but today, in a way, along with energy that we see being a big issue right now in the world, and economics and religion always in the background. These are dividers. They're things that divide humans rather than unite us. So from that point of view, science perhaps can bring us a new perspective or a new way to look at the entire field of knowledge. And I would mostly concentrate today on field of knowledge. I will also say a few things about practice, and primarily really in terms of non-dual traditions. I would primarily concentrate on Kashmiri Shaivism because we don't have the time to get into the Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, which of course is the great sister or the great twin of Shaivism, and certainly not. We don't have time to get into non-dual Buddhism, and as you said, Taoism, and I believe also the Western religions, the Western philosophies, and also the Muslim philosophies, for example, as developed by particularly the Persians hundreds of years ago, that were also had this Advaita outlook of life. By Advaita, I mean non-dual, of course. So without further ado, let me try to share with you to share the screen, if I may. And so the topic of the talk is spirituality and science, and I actually put a subtitle: Perspectives from Quantum Mechanics and Non-Dual Traditions. The institute that I had is actually called ECHO, which stands for Institute for Earth, Computing, Human, and Observing. It's a newly formed institute. We formed it with the good graces of our provost and the president, because they felt that what we were doing before, which was primarily really climate research, we're doing way more than that. So we might as well recognize it in terms of an institute, which represents, I would say, more what is the reality of what we are doing. Is this presentation okay, or should I put it full screen? It's okay? Great. I would like to thank the organizers, and let's see how to go here. And particularly, I would like to acknowledge, of course, Professor Naresh Singh and Professor Sudipatra, the Center for Complex Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy, and Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. And we have here some slides that were shared to me with that perhaps can provide by Sudip Patra, that perhaps can provide some more background as to what we call the quantum-like. You see that thirdly, quantum-like modeling in social sciences. So I will say a few things about quantum-like, but I would primarily really talk about quantum today, and maybe another time we can, excuse me, can focus more on quantum-like. I would like to start by pointing out that if indeed there's a convergence between science and spirituality, then there must be underlying principles or that are being shared. Otherwise, what would unite them? Well, ultimately, I think what really unites the science of spirituality and the science of let's say climate change or effects of climate change or social implications is really the human being. And this is why I would say that in our case, in my case, the institute that I'm now the director, has a very, very important component, extremely important component, which is the human. We always stand in science to keep the human out. So, but before we get to the human aspect, let's talk about the three principles that manifest at all levels. And I would say in all fields. They come primarily from quantum physics and extended to quantum-like. By the way, quantum-like, just to really show that it's not a big difference between quantum and quantum-like. People used to think that quantum only applies at the micro level, at the atomic and particle level, whereas quantum-like has been shown, and now as it applies in social sciences, as the work we're doing jointly at your university, that in fact it's still the universe is still quantum-like, I would say, and the three primarily principles that, in my mind at least, allow this to happen are three principles: complementarity, non-locality, and interactivity and organization. The first one, complementarity, is very, very much, in fact, from the quantum physics as was developed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in the so-called Copenhagen Adaptation. Now there are many different interpretations of Copenhagen interpretation in 40 minutes or 45 minutes. And please, someone keep track of time and tell me when I need to wrap up in about 5 minutes, just to make sure, because sometimes I tend to go a little bit over. Great, thank you, Divya. So in any case, complementarity comes directly, of course, from quantum physics, and it greatly applies to quantum-like, where quantum-like, we mean that basically what we see at the quantum level goes beyond the pure atomic and nuclear and particle level, but then perhaps to macro levels, and I would say the human levels, which is very, very important. The second one is non-locality. This is fairly obvious. There will be really no way, and I need to emphasize this, to do science unless the scientific laws and principles we pursue were totally local. Imagine if gravity, for example, was only local to the Earth, didn't apply to the stars, didn't apply anywhere else. It would be a very, very strange universe. And in fact, the first one to realize the non-local nature of physics, there was the great physicist Isaac Newton. In my mind, actually, Newton might be the greatest scientist. Maybe he's competing with Einstein, but I would say that Newton really got it right. And of course, he talked about the law of universal gravity, universal gravitation. He realized that the same law that pulls a human being to the Earth is the one that pulls the Earth around the sun and the moon around the Earth. And the only reason they don't fall, all these bodies, celestial bodies, don't fall on each other is because they have motion. It's of course described by Kepler and in the Great Revolution of the during Renaissance time. So non-locality means that the laws we follow in physics and I would say biology apply everywhere. The third one is interactivity. That says that basically two entities, they could be particles or they could be human beings. Unfortunately, these days, so we see it in societies in many ways. Social currents or social societies, they interact. And I'm not going to give any value judgment as to excuse me, whether the interaction is good or not good, but basically there is interactivity, not just between two bodies or two particles, but maybe multiple systems. Let's look a little bit more at the universe. The Newtonian universe is shown here. This is one of my own works of art that I did many years ago from one of my books. Basically, I was trying to show that the Newtonian universe, you have the observer right here on the left side, looks like Isaac Newton, and on the right side you have the universe, which is very complicated mechanism. At the time of Newton and before, they considered the universe as a clockwork universe because they thought that clocks are very complicated. Today, we know that the universe is way more complicated than clocks. And but this is just an illustration of perhaps the universe out there on the right side of the screen as you see it. And on the left side, you have the observer, who just looks at the whole thing and tries to make sense of the universe, as it were. Now I'll skip the 3 slides. I'll come back to at the end and go right into quantum. So the quantum universe says that there is this complementarity I was telling you before. There is a complementarity between wave particle. So on the left side, you see that a wave which extends over all dimensions, over infinity, and a particle, they seem to be antithetical entities. But it's not duality per se. So there's a big important difference between complementarity and duality. And this was actually pointed out by Niels Bohr. That we usually think of duality as opposites, well, I'm opposed to you, and so we're never going to meet. Whereas complementarity says we complement each other. So I think these days we need a lot of more complementarity and less duality. Our social systems, our political systems seem to still reside in duality rather than complementarity. On the right panel, you will see basically the wave particle complementarity. On the upper part, you see a number of quanta. They go through a slit, and the slit, then through the first slit, through 2 other slits, and they fall on the third screen, and they produce what is known as an interference pattern. And that's characteristic of waves. So if you just follow the top, you say, well, light, whether it's quanta, or in fact, you can do this with electrons, are really waves. However, if you said, well, I mean, electrons, we know they're little billiard balls, right? They're really tiny things. So the electron must have gone through one of the detectors. What are you talking about? So we're going to put a detector in one, either D1 or D2, detector 1 or D2 for slit 1 or slit 2, and see what happens. Well, when you do that, then the wave aspects disappear, and what in fact is that you get a sort of a shotgun pattern, as like a number of BBs or bullets go through, and they form more or less a centrally picked curve, and then with tails on either side that follows. That's distinctly non-interference. It's distinctly a particle aspect. So entanglement is a second major aspect of quantum, and in fact quantum-like, and non-locality you already talked about a little bit. So but I would also bring out the element of time, which is it seems to rule us in everyday life, and also it's very important in physics and probably biology as well, and social science as well. It looks to us, it seems to us that time flows in forward direction for macroscopic processes. That really means that there is a disorder that keeps increasing, and that gives us the hour of time. However, in macrocosm, this is very, very important. The laws of physics are symmetric with respect to time. Whether you're going backwards and forwards, it doesn't really matter. And in fact, the physicist, the great physicist who first realized that was Paul André Maurice Dirac, who realized that in fact the antiparticles were nothing more than electrons running back in time. They're just electrons, but they're running back in time, and they also have, of course, a positive charge or a negative charge. So the time is a little bit more complicated than the idea that it follows forward in one direction. Initial conditions become very important, which allow a system to develop, as well as final conditions. Can we provide more complete picture of evolution? For example, this is a big issue in evolutionary theory. I would say also in social sciences, it's not just the beginning, but also the end. Where are we going? But in any case, the point I want to bring out here is that time seems to be intimately tied to awareness, that particularly for humans, we are very aware of time, but we cannot really put our hands on it. I mean, we have clocks to measure it, but what is it? And according to Einstein's general theory of relativity, time is the fourth dimension. It's the fourth component of the space-time continuum. Space is much easier to visualize, but time is much harder to visualize. The reason space is so easy to visualize is because we have an object. So for example, if I raise this pen in space, then I'd say, well, that pen is here. And I see your wonderful faces on the screens, and then I associate your faces with space. Time, it's a little bit harder, so we keep track of time, but the time is more of like an internal, at least in the wisdoms of the East, an internal way to look at that. But in physics, here we have an experiment where you have light going, and this is very, very curious. Where you have it's called the delayed choice experiment. It was actually Richard Feynman who said that everything comes down to the double slit experiment, and everything in quantum physics. And he also said there's no one really that understands quantum physics. And he was, of course, one of the greatest quantum physicists himself. He said, I don't understand it. And if I don't understand it, then this is what Richard Feynman said, that I don't think anybody would understand it. Today, I would say that maybe you understand it a little bit more, but it has to involve a little bit more the role of the observer. In any case, going back to this slide, light comes from a source. It goes through the traditional double slit experiment. It's a focus and lens. And it goes through and falls sort of like a Venetian blind. Excuse me. And the last nanosecond, you make a choice whether to open the Venetian blind and let light go through, in which case, or in fact, close the Venetian blind and just leave it at that. If you leave the Venetian blind as it is, you get an interference pattern. But if you open the Venetian blind and it goes through the counters, then lo and behold, either this counter will click or this counter will click. So in the last nanosecond, you make a choice after the quanta have gone through these two holes, whether to observe the particle aspect or the wave aspect. And in fact, it was John Archibald Wheeler, a great quantum physicist and also a cosmologist, who said that actually it doesn't matter whether it's nanoseconds. Light could be coming from a distant quasar, and at the very last moment, you can make a choice to show the particle aspect or the wave aspect of light. It's very curious, because if light started billions of years ago, how can the choice, the last nanosecond, alter its path, for example. And this actually can happen if you have two rays from a distant quasar passing through a galaxy. This is the way you actually do it in cosmology. And in one case, the light follows one path, in the other case, it follows both paths. But this has happened billions of years ago. So what is going on here? So it is the act of observation that brings the whole thing together. So this is very, very curious, because actually now ties cosmology to quantum physics. Moving on, I would like now to concentrate particularly on something that will bring together the, in some direct way, what I call the dance of a proton, or the dance of a particle, and the dance of Shiva, or Paramashiva. So for the time being, let's concentrate on the upper left corner, where you have a particle, and this is one of the many loops of particles that a proton can become a neutron and a pi plus, and you can see how it splits into pairs, and actually there's an infinite number of these, and this was realized that by quantum physics, that this is the so-called problem, that you have way too many loops like that, and this moved to physicists to look at the real normalization and look at some ways that in fact perhaps these infinities cancel out, or in a way they don't prohibit one from actually doing physics. But the point is that you have a particle, the proton, that is maintained at the end, okay? It's maintained at the end, is still a proton at the end over here, but there are these loops. It can, and you see all these particles, a positive charge pion, and zero charge pion, negatively charged pion. So you have all these loops, and in the end, protons do the same. So these, of course, are the three main aspects of the dance of the proton, and the creation, and the sustenance, and the annihilation or destruction. So here the proton creates other pairs, but in the end it's maintained as a proton, and in the process actually it destroys itself, reappears in the end. So these are three cosmic functions that a mere proton performs. The last two are particularly important for spirituality, and they're called the grace and concealment. Grace really meaning that basically we forget the nature, and that nature is concealed. And in terms of humans, this concealment is represented by the ego. And the ego, by the way, can be personal ego, it can be social ego, it can be country ego, and we see all kinds of issues because of the existence of ego, in the sense of looking at individuality, whether it is an individual human being or a social gathering or a city, as being separate from everything else. And this has really led to countless wars, countless religious strifes. We're witnessing right now a lot of problems in the world. Rather than realizing that actually the ego, that what we call the ego, is nothing more than a limited sense of the supreme identity, if I can call it the supreme ego, which is Shiva himself. But Shiva is not egotistical, because in Shiva's eyes, and he, by the way, he does have eyes, and the Vedas describe very well that he can see. He can see without eyes. He can hear. He can hear without ears. So the supreme, this Brahman, as Vedanta, of course, identifies the absolute. Does not need ears and does not need eyes, but is everywhere and picks up sensory input even without auditory systems, etc., etc. It's very, very interesting. So let me jump now into non-dual Shaivism, and then we'll finish with some of the social aspects of that are particularly relevant to this group. So in non-dual Shaivism, Parama Shiva, Parama, of course, I don't have to explain that to your Hindus, but basically Parama Shiva is Supreme Shiva. Param means supreme. It consists always of Prakash or Prakasha and Vimarsha. Prakasha is the light of awareness, and or the being, I would say, the light of being, and Vimarsha is the awareness of the being. So Prakasha is the existence, if you like, or being, and Vimarsha is the awareness of the being. This is what I called before the superego or the I-ness. So Prakash and Vimarsha, or Prakash and Vimarsha in Kashmir Shaivism, they are the two aspects of the same coin. In Advaita Vedanta, there's a triadic, Sat Chit Ananda, Sat being, of course, being, Chit being awareness of being, and Ananda being the bliss of awareness of Chit. But Shaivite said, well, you don't really need to talk about Chit because Chit is there. So they combine into two main elements, the Prakash and Vimarsha. They're basically the same. Let's now switch to some practical aspects. And I would, one of my favorite mantras is Om Namah Shivaya, which means basically means I prostrate to Lord Shiva. But who is Lord Shiva? Well, actually, Shiva, the name means the Lord of auspiciousness. He's the one who is the very auspicious one who grants auspiciousness. In the Hindu pantheon, he looks strange. You know, he's sitting in a perfect meditation because he's the Lord of the ascetics and the recluses. He has a snake, or sometimes snakes, which represent the Kundalini energy, the inner spiritual energy, which the masters in ancient times, secret writings were saying that's the inner spiritual energy that has to be awakened. So it is actually the one that resides in the base of the spine. And when Kundalini, which means the coiled one, that's what Kundalini means, rises to the top of the head, then one achieves universal awareness of the oneness with Shiva. And what is the oneness with Shiva? Of course, it's Shakti. Shakti being the creatrix of the universe, if you like, the consort of Shiva. And there's no this couple is perfect. They are never separate. Human beings tend to separate, but Shiva and Shakti never separate. They are only really the two aspects of, if you like, more the passive aspect and the active aspect. The Shiva, the dancer, is particularly tied to destruction, but it's not necessarily bad destruction. It is the destruction that takes away the limited sense of ourselves. So the lower nature, if you like, is destroyed, making a way for new beings. We don't have the time to go through this wonderful picture of Shiva, but for example, he's wearing the moon on his forehead, the moon being a symbol for the mind. And he's sitting on tiger representing the lower passions. And he's holding a trident. Let's talk a little bit about the trident farther down. It's, of course, Shiva is the presiding, if you like, deity, or in a great sense of the great Kashmir Shaivism. And I would like to particularly concentrate a little bit on the Shiva Sutras, and just to talk about Shiva Sutras will take us years, but they're the aphorisms of Shiva, and there are, in fact, 5 most important powers of Paramashiva, even though Shiva is the infinite consciousness, has infinite powers. Chit, Ananda, Icha, Jnana, and Kriya. So Chit is a power of self-realization. Ananda is the absolute bliss. So remember before we said Chit Ananda. Chit Ananda, Icha, the power of will, Jnana, power of knowledge, and Kriya, the power to assume any form and to act. And these three powers, and this is the trident of Shiva: power of will, power of knowledge, and power to assume any form and to act, actually are very familiar in everyday life. Before you drive a car, you have to have a desire to drive a car, right? But if you don't know how to drive a car, you cannot drive a car. So you have to have the knowledge. So you have to, okay, I have the will today to drive a car. Well, I need to know how to drive a car. If I don't know how to drive a car, I'm going to crash, right? And then I have to get in and to drive a car. So these are the great powers, but somehow these are limited by below, and this below doesn't really mean high or low, by Maya, which is the cosmic illusion, what we call the great mother of the universe, who creates limited levels of duality. Here the question arises, why? And why is this happening? And my answer usually to that is, why not? Whenever there's a why, there's a quick answer is why not. Actually, the why not is because the infinite Shiva creates out of infinite being. In fact, it is Shakti herself, the creatrix of the universe, that creates infinite worlds and infinite beings. So I'm just going to concentrate on two particular sutras that are particularly sublime. The first one, I would say that in most traditions, you take the first sutra and it's got the whole 9 yards, as we say. It has everything there. And if you don't get the first sutra, well, then there are the sutras. So the first sutra is Chaitanya Matma, which is translated consciousness self. There's no verb, consciousness self. So the actual Sanskrit term for consciousness refers to luminous awareness, the light of being. Consciousness actually means more than just conscious awareness, because it has the absolute freedom. It's called Svatantriya in Sanskrit term, and also in Shiva. Svatantriya means the ability to freedom of will, knowledge, and action. Infinite will, knowledge, and action. So Svatantriya perhaps is the cause of the universe. This is actually very interesting, because we scientists think of the universe being created out of the Big Bang and whatever. We don't have time to get on that. But actually, Shaivism says it's Svatantriya that is the reason behind everything. It's the free will of the Lord. And how? Through Shakti, through his consort, the universal energy. The universal energy, though she's not male or female here. It's not a male or female, but she's the active part. She hides the nature of the self. She hides the nature of Shiva and presents duality. Well, now in physics, we know that the true story is complementarity and not duality. So if you like, in a way, Shakti is the complementary aspect of Shiva. The self is nature of reality and identical to consciousness. That's the first sutra. Well, then the second sutra says, if you didn't get that, you didn't catch that, then maybe you want to find out knowledge. How do I know the universe? And the second sutra is warning us, says Jnanam Bandhaha, which says the limited knowledge is the cause of bondage. Limited knowledge is the cause of bondage. Limited knowledge is the cause of bondage. And I would say that all knowledge at the human level is limited. In some ways, therefore, is bondage. But that's not for us to despair. It's just to realize the limitations of knowledge. And So knowledge is bondage, or limited knowledge is the cause of bondage. Ignorance gives rise to anava-mala, the primal ignorance of limiting conditions. So there are the malas. There's the anava-mala and the maya-mala. I don't have time today to go through the various malas in Shaivism, but basically they are and then these malas are the conditions, if you like, of a limitation, which limit the infinite being to become an individual being, and believe that he or she is a male or female, and ultimately the individual ego with individual mind, with intellect, of course, even the highest intellect, the most sublime intellect, it's still in some ways limiting, because it's his duality, or it's his principles that, even though they may be very sublime, they are not really Shiva per se. When you combine the two sutras, it's actually done by the great Shaivite master of, he passed away modern times, Swami Lakshmanju. When you combine them, and this is, you need to know a little bit about the Sanskrit, you combine them, you have Chaitanya Matma and plus Ajnanam Bandha. Ajnanam Bandha, consciousness, self, and no knowledge is bondage. Before we're saying that knowledge is bondage, he says no knowledge is bondage. So immediately our defenses go up. We say, no, knowledge is bondage and no knowledge is bondage. So what is going on? Well, it says that not really knowing your true self is bondage. Okay, thinking that the universe is separate from the self is bondage, and not knowing who you truly are is also bondage. So here you have again a complementarity that actually comes from the first and the second sutras together, put together in a very beautiful way in the Shiva Sutras. And I won't go more into that because we don't have the time. There are parallels, by the way, in the West. It's not just, of course, the sublime Vedanta and Shaivism, but we have the great traditions from Socrates himself, ancient Greece, who said, one thing I know is that I know nothing. But actually, people say one thing I know is I don't know anything. But actually what Socrates said, one thing I know is that I know nothing. So this was the foundation of Western philosophy. And then you have another great philosopher, Heraclitus, who actually talked about the vibration, talked about, in a way, consciousness is vibration. All entities move and nothing remains still. Everything changes and nothing remains still. And see that, of course, we saw that in the dance of Shiva and the dance of the particle. Everything changes and nothing remains the same. And you cannot step twice into the same waters of the river, to the same stream. So these are just two great philosophers mentioned in Greece. Of course, perhaps my favorite one is Plato, the disciple of Socrates, who put together the great philosophy of made it more practical of Socrates. So let's now look a little bit about sound, since sound is so important in everyday life. And this is the Sri Yantra. It's actually this is a multidimensional diagram. It connects sound and science. Science, the sound, vibration, and form. It's very, very curious that when actually you put it on a tonoscope, which means a device that that records the sound. The sound of Om, from being the primal sound of creation, if you like, it forms a Sri Yantra. This is very, very strange. The sound Om is created through Sri Yantra. So what you hear in a graphical way, actually you can find it in a physical way through this tonoscope. So in terms of this, five levels of perfect levels of Shiva, you have the eye in this, where the Shiva and Shakti are combined. You have the unity of space-time, and then you have the three powers represented by the trident of Shiva. divine will, the limited will, divine will becomes limited will, divine infinite knowledge becomes limited knowledge, and the omnipotence, the ability to create infinite universe, becomes limited action of a human being. How does that happen? It's a big trick. Maya, who is actually the creatrix of the universe, the great mother, takes 5 cloaks, and we won't have time today, but that can be a future discussion of Kashmir Shaivism. Veils, basically veils, and like this veil, she veils these 5 ways that Shiva and Shakti, with their infinite powers, are always there, and creates what's called the 5 kachukas, which are limited conditions. So this is a fast primer of Kashmir Shaivism. I'm sorry, I don't have time to go more on that. I just wanted to show you one or two of the great.
Kafatos is getting close to the 5-minute mark. So
okay, yeah, actually,
use a few minutes also to.
Yeah, so actually,
what does this mean for the real world?
Yeah. So let's go to the real world.
Commas, of course.
So that's exactly right. That's why I left those 3 slides to the real world. What does all this mean? Well, in terms of natural hazard, global changes, socioeconomic issues, here you have if you like, a duality or a complementarity between adaptation and mitigation. These are, I would say, there are dual aspects, or they're complementary aspects of today. We know that that because of the way we're polluting the environment, we have the carbon dioxide, causing this, the warming of the atmosphere, etc. Because we're not really taking care of nature. Ecosystems, biodiversity are suffering, and we have the impacts on humans and nature are the 4 Fs. The 4 Fs are food and water, health, flu, and we see, of course, what's happening now with the flu, energy, another big issue, and economy, the finance. So the 4 Fs are in fact, in a way, are tied to these socioeconomic developments. And in terms of hazards and gradual changes of the Earth, the sea level rise, temperature increase, they're tied back to what we're doing to the Earth's environment. How do we mitigate these global changes? Well, let's just look at some of the issues here, and then I'll finish with one final slide. There perhaps, and this is something that your school can probably address much more better than I do. There are economic opportunities in mitigation adaptation. Remember, it's still a human being that I want to emphasize, a human that is important. And what is important is in these 3 laws of quantum-like universe is that it's the human and these quantum-like principles, complementarity, universality, and interactivity that always operate at the background, okay? Even though it looks like they don't operate, this is a quantum-like universe. So in terms of investment in climate change and for mitigation or adaptation, we need to have tools of decision making, and there are, of course, business opportunities in climate change mitigation. For example, energy technologies, not relying so much on some of these, coal burning power plants, which I realize that they are a necessity for countries like India and China because of the large needs for energy, and perhaps biomass to energy technologies. In climate change adaptation is to make sure that we restore the ecosystems that we seem to be destroying, to manage the forest in a better way than just cutting them down, to make sure that the water is clean and we manage it, and of course to make sure that we manage waste because we produce so much waste. I would say the last 2 bullets in gold is try to, perhaps we have to consider move away from danger areas, which means geographical areas that are perhaps subject to catastrophic impacts that to a large extent we ourselves are creating. That may include megacities. Megacities are traps right now, as we see in the war that's going on in part of Europe. And perhaps change the living and food habits that we have: recycling, energy consumption, agriculture, which is really for the benefit of the earth. And my last slide, which is the most complicated one, is to show you that this is what I call the grand unified theory of global change. I don't have time to go through that, but you will see on the left side the Earth system, and on the right side is the human society system. And they're tied together through modeling, through observations. Here are the hazards that I was telling before: fires, cyclones, etc., etc. And on the right side, the most important aspect was policy, development, economics, adapting, and mitigation. They are tied together through ethics, because ultimately what we do to the environment has to be ethical in a great sense. So with that, I would like to, I hope I didn't take much of your time, but I'd like to turn it over to questions and answers, discussion. And we'll leave the slide up for a little bit.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Kafatos. Grand sweep of these ideas. I have one or two questions myself, but let us turn first to see whether we have any questions from our audience first. Do you have anything? Please feel free to post the questions. There is still time in the chat box. Divya?
I think the first question came from Professor Arup Chatterjee, our good friend.
Yeah.
So Divya can read that. It is a longish observation.
Sure, Professor Patton, sorry. So Professor Chatterjee says that he wants a response from.
Should I read
Hear you.
that? Should I
can hear
read
you.
that? Yeah.
Maybe we can also unmute and ask a question directly.
Is it posted? Let me see. Oh, let me look at it. Oh yeah, okay, I can see it. Day bomb. It's about day bomb. Right. Right. Is conscience a purely social construct, or it has scientific correlates? I will give you my own personal view rather than a scientific view. I think it has to be personal and societal. Of course, conscience comes from, is related to consciousness. But to act well, or to act within, if you like, the bounds of what nature provides, I would say is the need of application, and not everything goes, but in fact to have a way to act on the environment that preserves the environment, preserves human societies, and comes from the good, what the ancient Greeks called the good. They also talked about the perfect. So they said the perfect is the enemy of the good. And many, many times we have seen the failure of perfection, because we're trying to have what's happening really is the goodness, not rather than the perfection. So these are just some thoughts. I would say that certainly not in quantum physics, we don't have that idea, but it becomes much more important, I would say, in social science and economics, to make sure that that the values, lifting, and they apply to all human beings and hopefully all the species. And we see that a specific application has to do with the way that we distribute, for example, the the COVID-19, vaccination. It has to be good for everybody. It can be just for some people or some countries. So this is a relative, I would say, this is a relative way to look at it, and the debate is going on.
Mhm. Any other questions? Divya?
No, Professor, not in the chat, but maybe.
Well, let me just use the opportunity to mention to all that tonight we are having a view from a physicist and someone who is an adept practitioner of Kashmiri Shaivism. On Thursday, we will have the view on consciousness from a cognitive neuroscientist, Donald Hoffman, who will share his views as to what he thinks. And what is going to be particularly interesting is how he will explain Maya, how he will explain why is it that we are not well suited to grasp reality right away. And that's the nature of what appears as our no knowledge of that is going to be interesting to see from the biology side, the cognitive neuroscience side, which we will have on Thursday. So these two should complement each other quite well.
Yeah, he's a close friend.
I can really imagine. I can really imagine.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So if you have time, Menas, you should join us on Thursday at the same time at
Okay.
9 a.m.
Same link. Okay.
We'll send you a new link. Any other questions?
So there's another question? Or?
Yeah, people can unmute. Pawan?
Thank you. Yeah, I've just put that in chat. I was just wondering if, Professor Kafatos, if you could just expand a little further, just towards the back end of your talk, after you'd set the scene explaining quantum principles and Shaivism principles, and then you start talking about climate change issues. But if you could perhaps unpack a little more, your wisdom and thinking about how does this type of thinking help us guide us towards potential solutions on the quantum side? I mean, if we understand Shaivism principles a little bit better,
Correct.
Where does that guide us? Where does that take us to from a solution perspective?
Correct. Of course, the solutions are long, and the process is long, but it boils down to the three principles. It really boils. That's at the very beginning: the complementarity, the universality, and the interactivities. You see, the climate system, you have all three of them. You have the Earth, quote unquote, out there, and you have the human. Well, they are really complementary, and I think the slide that I show on the very last slide I shows that complementarity. It becomes more complicated than just either or, but it's always there. Then the universality has to do that what happens at a specific country level or a specific community level affects the entire planet. So from that point of view, that's also a universal principle of quantum-like. And the third one is interactivity. So the first one is complementarity, the second one is universality, the third one is interactivity. As I said at the very beginning, what we do locally affects the entire planet. So it's not quantum, that it is that basically in the sense that you're looking for atomic processes in the climate system, for example, but you're looking for the principles behind all atomic processes that operate. I would put to you, as I put it forward, that they operate at the social, economic, and human levels, as well as the quantum level. And this is where actually quantum-like becomes a little bit more relevant. And this is the work we're doing with your group at your university, to try to see how this universal principles apply to, specifically with Sudip Patra, how these universal principles apply to quantum-like, because the world is really quantum-like rather than quantum per se. Quantum-like is the generalization of quantum. So in that sense, the universe is quantum-like, and these principles operate at every level, including the climate change. This is a quick answer to, but to go further than that, I think exploring more, developing more systems of thought would be something that would be a great project for a joint project for all of us to undertake. And I cannot, of course, do that in 40 minutes or 45 minutes, but basically it comes down to these three principles.
Well, why maybe Sudeep, since he has been working with you for quite a while, Sudeep can also add something on that point. Sudeep?
Yeah, thank you very much for this great talk. Yes, we have been working for quite some time now on different projects and also a book project now. But yes, going back to quantum-like modeling, one thing is, first of all, as Menas really pointed out, that we are really not taking that very much reductionist view that ultimately everything has to boil down to particles and, you know, we are working wave functions, as some people mentioned very recently. But we are not taking that view. So quantum-like is rather about the framework and about these principles, these great principles, which are also relevant for quantum physics as well as for societal decision-making and individual decision-making, etc. For example, we have seen that right from the beginning, I mean, from 1920s and 30s, the founders of quantum mechanics, going back to Niels Bohr and also Heisenberg, and definitely later on various other luminaries, Neumann and so on, they really observed that there's some very striking similarities between the formalism of quantum mechanics and decision-making processes. So that there comes in the principle of contextuality, that decision-making is very, very contextual in nature, and uncertainty, certainly, ontological uncertainty, and so on. So these are the principles which are reflected in our modeling, in quantum-like modeling. And then as Menas was also like referring to, like in case of climate change, for example, that's a very good kind of a fertile ground to see that how these principles may work in practice. For example, there is this deep uncertainty and there is this contextuality, complementarity. So in those areas, quantum-like modeling can really help understand how decision-making actually happens in those scenarios. And there's a huge amount of research going on and we are also up to it. So that would be like our more pragmatic approach towards that, rather than saying that everything is quantum.
Right. Correct. Thank you. Contextuality is actually very important. In a way, it was implied in everything I said, but I didn't use the term. Contextuality is, of course, the context of what you observe determines what you observe. So, yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Anybody would like to unmute and make a comment, ask a question?
Hi, Professor. This is Anand. I have a question. The thing is, okay, we are talking about the spirituality and and its equivalence in quantum physics, and yeah, the spirituality, how we can apply in public policy. So we are making connections between various, say, verticals or specializations, we can say that, of physics, spirituality, and everything. How can my question is, like, for a common man who has to have a realization about, say, the climate change or global warming, whatever the things that we are talking about, how can we make the common man understand that the spirituality is a very important aspect of that individual, to make them realize that that is a major contribution towards towards mitigating the climate change, whatever that is. So how can we make a common man understand this nexus between spirituality and science, and whatever we are talking from the academic point of perspective, academic point of view? How can we make that? Yeah, my question: how can we make a common man understand this?
Thank you. This is a very, very good question. It's actually I hope it's not academic, but it's very real. And these three principles are very real. And that's actually where also the ethics comes in to the picture. My personal view is that there's no regular life and spiritual life. That dichotomy, I don't think is there. There's only spiritual life.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But the understanding of common man is not such, right? So
That's
taking
right.
that into premise, yeah.
Exactly right. And I think for that, big blame, I won't blame anybody, but a big has to do with we academics and scientists who actually say that science and spirituality have nothing to do with each other. That spiritual, you can do whatever you want, you can follow whatever religion you want, but this is the real world that we live in. Whereas in an integrated way, that if you look at the Earth, it's herself, let's say the Earth as a living planet, then our everyday life is actually spiritual life. And I would say the ancient Advaita schools, they view it that way. It's
Right.
unfortunately that it has misrepresented or misunderstood. And I would say that if I can say that is now up to the great Hindu traditions to bring it back, because the case can be made perhaps much stronger in India because of all these traditions that were there for a long time than to be made but in the West, because the West forgot Plato, they forgot Socrates, and even the great philosophers of the Renaissance. So yeah, maybe this is where India can play a very, very important role.
Okay.
So we have to,
Sorry, I have one follow-up question.
right, go ahead. And after that, we have two more. We have Sumalata and then Arup. So go ahead, Anand.
I'll make this question very brief. As Professor Kafatos said that India can play a major role. I mean, is there any credence that we can see in the form of Bhakti Yoga? Because Bhakti Yoga is very simple to teach to people, to common people. Can that be used as a vehicle to make people understand or be aware about the surroundings or the environment and everything? Is there any possibility? Do
Absolutely.
you see any credentials in that?
Absolutely. Bhakti Yoga, as Krishna indicated in the Bhagavad Gita, and there was, of course, there was a big debate whether Jnana Yoga or Bhakti Yoga, which one is higher, the debate.
Yes.
At the end of the day, because we live in Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, Bhakti is the easiest way for everyone. And actually, these great Shaivite masters were Bhaktas themselves. They were not just philosophers that were just. They were actually. They were, for example, they were Bhaktas of Shiva. They were Bhaktas of Shakti. So they are the underlying thing, easiest way, and this can take on the form of chanting, which is very easy in all religions. There's chanting, chanting of the mantras, but it is very, very important to bring in the element of devotion and to the divine. I would say the devotion to the divine. That would be one way to put it.
Okay, let's go to Sumalata.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Professor, like even my question is in the tracks of the previous question. Even I want to ask the same question, like because the ancient text seems to have a lot of knowledge, which now science is trying to prove. Rising the question is like science versus spirituality. So I just want to know, is like, science actually making everything rational so that it can prove itself, or is it science proving the spiritual aspect? Is it leveraging the spirituality? What role the science plays here? I just want to know this.
I'm sorry. Your last question.
Yeah, I just want to know, like, science acting as a leverage for promoting spirituality, or science, because of its emphasis on proving everything rationally, is it questioning the spirituality? This is what I want to know.
Well, of course, there's always questioning, but there's one thing to question. and there's another thing to reject. That is, in fact, at the time that the great Shaivite masters were bringing forward Kashmir Shaivism, there was a debate. There were debates going on with the Buddhists, and they were actually coming from a good place because they were concerning with the nature of reality. It was not from a bad place to say, well, my belief system is better than yours. But and for example, the Shaivites were adamant, Utpaladeva, particularly, of course, Abhimanagupta, and to say that the self is conscious awareness. It's not just existence, but it is a conscious existence. So whereas the Buddhists said, well, some of these sections sects of Buddhism, but because I have some great friends who are Buddhist monks in Korea, for example, and they see the same thing. They say the same thing that we're saying here. And I don't think that's what Lord Buddha actually taught. But rather than worrying about what itself is as an individual presence, to just actually do the practical aspects. But the Shaivites would say, well, no, it is actually the self is conscious awareness, and we need to keep that in mind. So there are these nuances, differences, or complementaries. There's also, of course, the nuance of Advaita Vedanta, which states neti neti, means not this, not this, not this, not this, which one may say, well, what does that mean? Whereas Shaivites would say, and this, and this, and this, and this. In the end, they come out the same. The Shaivites say everything is Shiva, everything that you see around is Shiva. And the Advaita Vedanta said, if you think that this is Shiva, that this is Brahman, actually Brahman is beyond all of them. At the end, they both agree. So again, these nuances of non-dual paths are important, but in ancient India, including the Buddhists, I would say, they realized that there were nuances rather than categorical differences which lead to formation of religions and wars and everything else we see, which is the unfortunate path that many religions have developed today. This is a short answer to what
yes, Professor, thank you. But still, okay. I just want to know, like, the Professor, just one more question. Like, science seems to have getting a lot of inputs from spirituality. So what input spirituality can get from science? Is there a scope of it? Is it like, is the balancing act is happening? Right. So what aspects can spirituality get from science? Well, for example, the three principles I mentioned, the three quantum-like principles, they apply at all spiritual levels. So that's then if it's known that this is actually quantum-like, then all of a sudden the spiritual paths are not just individual paths that have to do with history, that have to do with the tradition, perhaps, but they are cemented in a nice way to universal principles. So certainly spirituality from that point of view can be reinforced by saying that, look, these same principles apply to science and spirituality. That would be a short answer to your question. They both can learn from each other. In fact, I would say that ultimately everything is spiritual anyway. Perhaps the next yuga of humanity is to go beyond Kali Yuga and realize that science and spirituality are not really that different from each other. They're just different modes of looking at reality.
Final question from Arup. Arup, please go ahead. You can unmute, put on your video if you wish.
Good afternoon, Professor Kafatos. For most of
Good
us,
afternoon.
It's like a dream come true for most of us. So I was the person who asked you the question on conscience. I have a sort of follow-up question, and I recognize that this might be perhaps a question on neurophysiology, and yet I'd be grateful for your impromptu thoughts. Do you foresee a kind of do you foresee any kind of a correlation between quantum non-locality and the science of dreaming? or from a Kashmiri Shaivist standpoint, have you ever thought of dreams and what might be the application of Shaivism or quantum modeling or quantum theories on the science of dreaming?
Menas, are you with us, or have we lost you? Might be a power interruption or something. Menas, you have to unmute. We are not hearing you.
Pretty tough a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what's the basic question?
Yeah, Professor, my question was, is there perhaps a correlation between quantum modeling or quantum theories on the one hand and Kashmiri Shaivism on the other, and sciences of dreaming or experiences of dreaming?
Yes, there are connections. I have outlined some of them in one of my recent books. The name of the book is Science, Reality, and Everyday Life. And the science is basically quantum-like. The reality is the philosophy of looking at the world from the point of view, not just Kashmiri Shaivism, but also a little bit Advaita Vedanta and also Platonic ideals, Platonic theory. And then the last one is the everyday life. What do we do with these principles? And actually their steps. So there's a connection. It has to come down to what do we do? And the issue is that a lot of the times these discussions remain at the philosophical or intellectual level. And then the common person, as was pointed out before, says, so what? But if we realize that in fact we ourselves as human beings, we operate under these three principles all the time. The environment, the earth. So in that sense, everything is quantum. I would say everything is quantum-like. And therefore, including all the challenges that we face in terms of climate change and economics. Now, ethics is a little bit trickier because values come into the picture. So, and this, of course, is where Socrates himself actually talked a lot about it. And for example, let me just point out that in the case of Socrates, he followed the values of the city of Athens. They condemned him to death for he didn't do anything, but they condemned him to death. And he said, "Okay, this is what my city has determined for me. I will follow it because this is the ethical thing to do." I'm now paraphrasing, of course, quite a bit. So, ethics is a little bit tricky one because really what seems to be good for one side may not be good for the other side. But again, it's complementarity, so as long as we keep those three principles, in mind, we're fine.
Right, and we do distinguish between deontology and ontology. So the deontological ethics and ontological ethics we cover in our class as well. Yeah. Anyway, I think we have come to that point of time when we should wrap up, and I think it cannot be more fitting than for me to ask your close friend and collaborator, Menas, Professor Sudeep Patra, to say a few closing words.
Thank you so much. I mean, as Arup was saying, that it is also a dream come true to personally me also, knowing Menas. I remember I was following his works from my student days. I mean, Glasgow days are all filled with, going through his videos and working through his papers. So it's really a big deal knowing him. And now certainly,
thank you.
certainly the most important thing is that the collaborations that we are doing now, both from our perspective, we are working on a book project, but more importantly from Center's perspective, because here we see that there are different perspectives. Some people are more interested in the interface between science and spirituality. Applied spirituality, for example, is something which we really believe in, the application side of it. So, and then certainly complexity science, application of complexity science in wicked policy problem, as Professor Singh always reminds us. And it is high time that we start looking into these alternative models, quantum-like models, for example, principles, to see that how to make the bridge again with the real world problems and, the great traditions of East and so on. So in that case also, we really depend that our collaboration with Menas and definitely with Chapman University overall, that might be quite fruitful. And in a way, we really invite all our colleagues to kind of join in that journey. So maybe Arup and others who have great ideas, they can really join us and work through. Finally, I would just like to mention that, as Professor Kafatos was explaining, that there is a lot of influence nowadays of Eastern philosophical traditions on quantum mechanics per se. Like at least two of the traditions, and I will just end on this, that another of my, very senior co-author, I should say, sound like my teacher, Professor Partha Ghosh, who is also like a very well-known quantum physicist. So he gave me a very interesting, correspondence between some scientists, and they are working on a very hardcore quantum physical model, as we know as cubism, quantum Bayesianism. And strikingly, that later starts with Advaita Vedanta. It says that, everything is observations, and then it goes into modeling. So, this confluence is really happening, convergence is really happening. We just have to kind of relate that to real world problems. And for that, no one is better suited than Professor Menas Kafatos. So thanks a lot from our entire team and also our university. And we keep collaborating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Menas. Thanks to all who participated and stayed up for this late hour.
Thank you.
We will send out the invite for the Thursday lecture, where a cognitive neuroscientist, one of the leading ones in the world, will address these issues as well from that perspective. I think you will find it fascinating. Professor Don Hoffman wrote a book called The Case Against Reality. You might take a look at that, and please join us then. Thanks again, and good night to all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.